My favorite game of all time is one that I shouldn't even like. In fact, my favorite game happens to be categorized as my least favorite genre of all time. And this isn't some situation where I'm trying to objectively pick the best game I've played and say it's my favorite. No, I truly love a game that I should, by all means, hate, which is a thought that's been puzzling me lately. A little bit ago while I was watching a Nintendo Direct, a question popped into my head that felt like an impossible to solve paradox. How can my favorite game also be categorized as my least favorite genre? Of course, the answer is always in the game design, so today I want to take a look at how game designers can break the rules to make a game better. Now, my favorite type of game has to be platformers, and when you think about it, it's not that much of a surprise considering it was the first genre of game I ever played. When I was really young, my dad introduced me to whatever game we had at the time, and back then, we didn't have too many games at our disposal. The few games that we could get our hands on were almost entirely comprised of some type of platformer, and the experiences I had with those games are what molded me into the gamer I am today. My father and I would spend hours navigating the green hills of Sonic the Hedgehog, throwing baby Yoshis in Super Mario World, and of course, exploring the sprawling worlds of Super Mario Bros. 3. My little brother and I would spend every day trying to beat the seemingly impossible gauntlet of levels from New Super Mario Bros. Wii, until I inevitably made my brother upset by throwing him off the edge and stealing all of his power-ups. And of course, my grandmother would show me the tricks and cheats that made it easier to get through whatever section of a game I was playing. These experiences not only influenced my favorite of platformers, but directly caused what mechanics I tend to enjoy in other video games. For example, the thing that I remember most about playing with my dad is the fact that he always knew of another secret within the level, and even when we had played through the game hundreds of times, he would blow my mind with some sort of new trick or hidden area that I never knew about. He always seemed to know about something new, like the hidden power-up below the floor in World 3-1, or the fact that lava isn't actually deadly in the second level of World 8, and these secrets left an imprint on my brain that has never really faded. But the secrets that really stuck with me are the ones that would reward our skill by giving us something extra as long as we were up for the challenge. For example, flying above World 1-1 would give you an extra life, and gaining enough speed to fly off those same clouds would reward you with a secret room given your flying skills were good enough. In World 3-4, by going far enough to the right to spawn a Lakitu and traveling all the way back to get a Koopa shell, you could in turn use the Spinies to rack up infinite lives. And these hidden rewards had something in common. For the most part, my ability to obtain these secrets was based on whether or not my skill level was high enough, and because of that, to this day, I tend to gravitate more towards games that reward higher skill levels. With my brother, I remember most about the way exploration was handled within our favorite game. In New Super Mario Bros. Wii, there was always some star coin or room that was hidden, but didn't block you off by heightening the required skill level like in Super Mario Bros. 3. Finding these secrets didn't make the game easier in any way. They were completely optional, sometimes even superfluous. Today, games that force you to find something to progress, or even games that don't allow for a meaningless fun exploration, tend not to be my thing. And of course, when it comes to my grandmother, I have vivid memories of the tricks she would show me to circumvent an undesirable moment, and I don't necessarily mean a glitch or a hack. What I mean is that in a lot of those classic platformers, there were options to get around certain unwanted sections. I still remember that she was the one who showed me about the warp zone in Super Mario Bros., and I can vividly recall when she revealed to me that if you were able to fly above a certain ghost house in Super Mario World, you could unlock the top secret area, granting you free power-ups and Yoshis. Of course, both of these tricks would make it possible to avoid something I didn't like, or make my experience a little easier, and to this day, I love it when I'm able to get around something I don't want to do, but still play the game. Now, obviously, I wouldn't stick to only platformers my whole life. In fact, it was not long after I beat all of these games that I would start experimenting with different genres. Of course, I got into the 3D platformers such as Banjo-Kazooie, Super Mario 64, and Mario Galaxy. But along the way, I picked up my first non-platformer I ever tried. Luigi's Mansion was an odd little launch title for the GameCube, but if you have ever played it for yourself, you would know that it's one of the most charming little adventure games you can play. The gameplay felt wildly different from what I was used to, but that didn't stop me from falling in love with this weird little spin-off. In fact, I would probably rate Luigi's Mansion as one of my top 10 favorite games of all time, and it was this title that got me into games like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Yes, Luigi's Mansion is what got me to try The Legend of Zelda, but besides being the first person in the world to ever say that, I was also incredibly interested in how other games could be even more different. Luckily for me, my parents had decided to get an Xbox 360, and after being explained why the hell I couldn't play Super Mario Bros. On an Xbox for the 5th time, I was finally willing to try some new types of games, and they were incredible. Over the next few years, I would play beat-em-ups like Castle Crashers, open-world adventures like Skyrim, rhythm games like Rock Band, fighting games like Soul Calibur, and Simpsons Hit and Run, because I wasn't allowed to play Grand Theft Auto. The point is, I was opened up to a whole world of video games, and I was no longer stuck only playing the 2D platformers I started out with. I had managed to try almost every type of video game you can imagine, but one specific genre had somehow evaded me, and it wasn't until my dad brought home one of the best surprises I've ever gotten that I would get the chance to experience this genre. Although I had played a lot of Xbox and PlayStation games up to this point, I was always a Nintendo kid at heart, and my family had no issue with the idea of needing different consoles for different games. Because of this, my parents brought me and my brother a red Nintendo DS Lite for us to share. Sadly, we didn't truly utilize this new console because we only had one, and we usually opted for playing a game together. But one day, my father walked in through the front door after work and he sat us down to talk. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out another red DS Lite. Apparently, while he was at work, one of the customer's kids had left their DS behind, and after a couple of weeks of no one coming to claim it, my dad decided to bring it home for us to play. Not only did this open a world of multiplayer games for my brother and me, but the Game Boy slot held a cartridge with a game that was wildly different from anything I had tried before. The game was Pokemon Fire Red, and it just so happened to be a turn-based RPG. This game would be my first and only experience with a turn-based RPG, but sadly, it left a bad taste in my mouth to say the least. I was able to get my starter Pokemon and began heading right out towards the rest of the world, but on the way, I was told I needed to catch another Pokemon by weakening them first. At least, that's what I think he said, because of course, I skipped right through the dialogue and didn't understand what my goal was. I ended up killing the first few tutorial Pokemon so much that I leveled my Charmander up to the point where he would kill anything with one hit. Turns out you can't weaken a Pokemon if it's dead. This experience definitely left me bitter, and even today there are many aspects of the turn-based genre that don't appeal to me. Many years afterward, right around my birthday, I would ask my parents for the Nintendo Wii U, and about a week before my birthday, my mother sat me down to explain that at the time, we weren't able to afford to buy the new console. I was heartbroken. The realization that I couldn't get my dream present, piled on top of the fact that I had just been opened up to the sad world of money issues, caused me to break down crying in front of my best friend on the bus. He was a couple grades ahead of me, but always treated me like a little brother, and when he saw how upset I was, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a wrapped gift. This present was a teal 3DS, and he told me that he wanted to give it to me a couple days early. His birthday was the same month as mine, and he had just upgraded to the 3DS XL from one of his presents, so he was able to hand down his console. But along with this 3DS came a choice. Either he would give me Super Mario 64 DS or one of his Pokemon games. I immediately said no to Pokemon because of my past experience with the game, and while he was giving me Super Mario 64 DS, he told me that I should always give every game a second chance. His response stuck with me, and because of it, today I actually enjoy many turn-based RPGs, and I've even righted my wrong when it comes to Pokemon. But still, turn-based RPGs are my least favorite genre, which makes it all the more confusing why my favorite game of all time is Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. Now, I'm not going to tell you why a certain video game genre sucks, and I'm certainly not going to tell you that my favorite game is better than yours. If you love turn-based RPGs, then that's amazing. If you hate platformers, then that's perfectly fine, because we are all gamers and part of one collective group. What I'm actually interested in is finding out how anyone can dislike a genre, but love a game within that genre. While trying to tackle this seemingly impossible to answer question, I decided to make a list of all of the contradictions that I or other people have had when it comes to their game preferences. The obvious example for me is how a lot of people don't like RPGs but love Paper Mario. But there are lots of other examples, such as not liking racing games but loving Mario Kart, not liking fighting games but loving Super Smash Bros., and of course not liking sports games but loving Mario Golf. All of these titles are of course Nintendo, but that's not the only time I've seen this sort of thing happen. People can hate puzzle games but love Portal. People can hate platformers but love Celeste. And people can absolutely loathe horror games but love the indie classic Five Nights at Freddy's. In the past, I have brushed this off as people just having specific preferences, but that doesn't explain why some of these examples seem to be so common within gamers. It's not just a couple of people who share these weird quirks, it's entire groups that have these contradictions within their preferences. And because this phenomenon seems to follow specific games and it's so widespread, it leads me to believe that these games must have something fundamentally different within their design. If you haven't seen my other videos and don't know what the 5 fundamentals of game design are, then I suggest you watch this video so you can better understand this next segment. But for a tiny recap, the sense of reward is the concept of causing a player to have a positive emotional response towards the game designer's desired actions. The sense of punishment is the concept of causing a player to have a negative emotional response towards the game designer's undesired actions. Goals give the player a reason to seek out the sense of reward, and constraints allow the sense of punishment to properly have an effect on the player. Lastly, consistency keeps the player aware of what is a punishment and what is a reward. Interestingly enough, the outliers within people's preferences don't usually utilize these principles differently in any meaningful way. Paper Mario's basic sense of reward comes from defeating enemies, and the sense of punishment comes from not being able to defeat said enemies. The goal is generally to progress to the next section, which is only accomplished by completing objectives that give you a sense of reward. The constraints prevent you from circumventing the sense of punishment by not fighting certain enemies, and of course, the game's fundamentals are consistent and never stray away from these simple ideas, which isn't any different from the methods other RPGs use in their design, and it's a similar story with something like Mario Kart. Mario Kart's fundamental sense of reward comes from passing other players. The sense of punishment comes from making mistakes and being sent further back in the race. The goal is to get first place, which is only possible by passing players. The game's constraints prevent you from winning without driving properly, and of course, the game is consistent in all of these aspects and never allows for something to break the rules, such as driving backwards to reach first place. And this is consistent with any other racing game, so what's the deal? How are these games so similar to the others within their genre, but still stand out? Well, actually, it comes down to the fact that the outliers add another mechanic to the game that feels secondary to the player, but is treated as though it's just as important to the game's overall design. What I mean is that the designers add an entirely new set of rules that add to the fundamentals already in place. This is a little hard to explain, but let's take another look at Paper Mario to see if we can better understand this idea. Paper Mario adds the ability to affect the amount of damage you can deal by pressing specific buttons at specific times. Now, if you took this mechanic away, it wouldn't actually end up changing the game's base design principles because this addition is secondary to the player. But taking away this mechanic would make the game feel empty, like something is missing. And that's because the designers treated this mechanic as though it was just as fundamental to the game's design as their basic goals and constraints. As another example, Mario Kart adds the ability to affect the outcome of the race with the items you pick up throughout the track. Getting rid of these items wouldn't change the fact that you are trying to drive as best as you can to reach first place, but it would in fact change the way that the game feels because Nintendo treated this mechanic just as important as the race itself. It's a similar story with something like Super Smash Bros., although there is obviously a big group of people that don't like the items, but they are not the majority. Mario Golf adds insane level design that you just can't get with other golf games, and Super Mario Strikers adds a new level of hecticness and chaos that isn't found in any other soccer game. Now, like I said before, although it is very common to see Nintendo do this sort of thing, they aren't the only ones who can accomplish this weird phenomenon. Take for instance The Last of Us. I've seen a lot of people say they don't like zombie games, but love this title, and that's because in most zombie games, the basics boil down to not getting bit and surviving as long as you can to progress the game. But in The Last of Us, the emotional connection to the story is treated as just important as not getting bit. In Five Nights at Freddy's and Amnesia: The Dark Descent, the base design principles of finding a way to survive are still the main focus, but the aspect of being powerless is used as a secondary mechanic that is overall just as important. Basically, these games align with the expected design principles that come with their genre, but they stick out because they add a mechanic or idea that is just as important to the game's overall concept. But these games don't just stick out because they add something new. They stick out because they defy the very rules that their genre sets in place. Turn-based RPGs usually operate under the rule that your stats will get better the more you fight, which is still true in Paper Mario, but along with this idea is the concept that your skills in battle will directly impact how well you do overall. This mechanic combats the very idea that this genre is known for, that being that the only thing affecting your ability to battle is your stats or strategy. Racing games operate under the rule that your skill at maneuvering directly impacts your ability to do well in a race. But the items in Mario Kart combat this principle by adding luck to the equation. The best Mario Kart driver in the world isn't necessarily guaranteed success because because of the items within the game. The designers create this sort of juxtaposition within the game's fundamentals, and it's these contradictions that make people love these games. If you don't like RPGs but do like Paper Mario, it's because the game almost defies the aspects you don't like. But the people who do like RPGs still enjoy Paper Mario because even though there is a contradicting aspect to the gameplay, the game doesn't sacrifice the original principles. The last important thing when it comes to these mechanics is that they directly impact the way that the player thinks about the game. Under normal circumstances, a player playing a racing game may think that the way to do better is solely dependent on their ability to improve their skill. But in a game like Mario Kart, a player might assume if I grab more items, I can do better. And that assumption might be correct. The player stops playing Mario Kart as if it's a racing game. Instead, they tackle their issues as a strategy game. So if someone doesn't like racing games, they may appreciate a game like Mario Kart because the game encourages players to play the game in a strategic mindset. Of course, people don't usually think of Mario Kart as a strategy game, but that's what the mechanics encourage you to play like. I know that's a lot of information to take in, but to summarize, video games that successfully stick out from their genre tend to add a secondary mechanic that is treated as though it's just as important to the game's design. This mechanic contradicts the expectations that come with the genre, but doesn't overpower them. And most importantly, this secondary mechanic causes players to subconsciously interact with the game in a different way. Implementing this idea can cause a wider group of people to enjoy your game, but if it isn't pulled off successfully, it can alienate the original audience the game was meant for. After all, if you change something about a genre too much, you start to get situations like the roguelike and roguelite debates. But as a basic guideline, in order to achieve this goal, you would need to add a secondary mechanic to your game that is treated as if it's just as important as your basic design principles. But breaking the rules of a genre successfully does not come from you slapping some weird mechanic in at the last second. This mechanic should be just as fleshed out and integral as everything else. This mechanic should never break the consistency you have already designed. Instead, it should work to add something to the overall experience. And as well, this mechanic should be thought out with every aspect of your game's design. Much like how you worry about how different ideas fit into your overall concept, those same ideas should never hinder your secondary mechanic. Another aspect of this concept that is very important is that your secondary mechanic should in some way noticeably contradict the genre's definition. After all, you can't break rules without breaking the rules. But keep in mind that the contradiction comes from what people define the genre as, not a contradiction within your game's design. Like I've said, Paper Mario contradicts the idea that success in turn-based RPGs is only dependent on your stats, but it doesn't contradict the idea that defeating enemies is what allows you to obtain your goal. If you change the fact that defeating enemies gives you the ability to obtain your goal, you have a game like Paper Mario Color Splash, which, even while having turn-based combat, feels so far from what RPG lovers appreciate and has even caused a lot of people to not view it as an RPG. Lastly, this mechanic should make players subconsciously play the game in a different way, without making them feel as though it's an entirely different genre. For example, Five Nights at Freddy's forced players to stay completely still and tactically manage their resources, that being their power, while most horror games tend to cause their players to panic and hope for the best. The player plays FNAF as if it were a resource management game, but feels as though it's still a horror game. All of this originally stemmed from the fact that my favorite game is getting remade for the Nintendo Switch, and no matter where you stand personally on this remake, the question, how can my favorite game also be categorized as my least favorite genre, is still quite interesting. And for the most part, I am pretty satisfied with this answer. Your favorite games can be a part of your least favorite genre if it defies the rules that tend to make you dislike that genre in the first place. Before I go, I just want to thank you guys so much for your continued support, and especially for making it to the end of this wordy essay. If you enjoy this type of stuff, I highly recommend joining our Discord in the description. Oh, and huge thanks to my patrons on screen now.